You're sitting on the tarmac, your seatbelt is fastened, your tray table is stowed, and your plane hasn't moved an inch in 20 minutes. The captain comes on the intercom to apologize, explaining they're waiting on clearance from the tower. It feels like a boring, bureaucratic annoyance, but every single delay, double check, and radio confirmation keeping you stuck in that seat exists for a very specific reason. In aviation, the safety rules are written in blood. On March 27, 1977, two massive Boeing 747s collided at full speed on a foggy runway in the Canary Islands. 583 people lost their lives, making it the deadliest aviation disaster in human history. No engines failed, no wings snapped off in midair. Instead, minor logistical headaches, bad weather, and human psychology stacked on top of one another to break a fragile system. The chain of events started miles away from the crash site. The separatist group called in a bomb threat at Las Palmas Airport, forcing authorities to divert 6 large passenger planes to a tiny regional airstrip on the neighboring island of Tenerife, Los Rodeos. This diagram shows the layout of Los Rodeos. It was never designed to handle international traffic, featuring only a single main runway and one parallel taxiway. Suddenly, it was forced to absorb massive diverted jets, rapidly clogging up every available square foot of pavement. To make matters worse, the technological infrastructure was dangerously bare. The control tower was staffed by only 2 operators, and the airport lacked ground radar entirely. The controllers couldn't see the planes on a screen. They had to rely on pilots verbally reporting their positions over the radio. Trapped in this traffic jam were 2 specific aircraft. First, a Pan Am Boeing 747, carrying 380 passengers. Right in front of it sat another 747 operated by KLM, carrying 234 passengers. The pilots couldn't move. The tower couldn't track the planes. It was a closed, overloaded system where nobody possessed the ability to see the complete picture. Inside the KLM cockpit, Captain Jacob van Zanten was watching the clock. Dutch labor laws strictly limited how many hours a pilot could stay on duty. Exceeding those limits carried severe penalties, heavy fines, potential imprisonment, and the immediate revocation of his license. To save time, he decided to refuel his plane right there in Tenerife. His logic was simple: fill the tanks now, drop the passengers at Las Palmas once it reopened, and immediately fly back to Amsterdam before his legal clock ran out. But that decision triggered 2 immediate problems. First, the KLM jet physically blocked the Pan Am plane behind it, trapping them on the tarmac for another 30 minutes. Second, the fuel added 50 tons of dead weight to the KLM aircraft. Exactly as the refueling finished, the weather shifted. Heavy clouds rolled down from the nearby mountains. Visibility on the runway plummeted from 2,000 meters and dropped to 300 meters. Looking at this runway map, we can see the exact dilemma facing the Pan Am crew. The tower ordered them to taxi down the active runway and turn off at exit C3. But C3 required a sharp 135-degree angle, a maneuver nearly impossible for a 340-ton jumbo jet. Assuming the tower made a mistake, the Pan Am crew opted to continue down the runway through the fog to the 45-degree C4 exit. Both giant aircraft were now operating entirely blind on the same strip of asphalt, separated by a wall of fog, communicating entirely over radio. The KLM jet reached the end of the runway, spun 180 degrees into takeoff position, and stopped. Captain van Zanten, feeling the weight of his expiring duty clock, pushes the throttle forward to take off, even though the tower had not granted clearance. His co-pilot rapidly hits the brakes, reminding him they don't have permission yet. Van Zanten was KLM's chief flying instructor, a legendary figure who had personally signed off on his co-pilot's 747 certification. The young co-pilot stops his boss once, but when Van Zanten reaches for the throttle a second time, the intimidation proves too much. He stays silent. The co-pilot jumps on the radio, trying to alert the tower by saying, "We are now at takeoff." The controller in the tower, assuming the plane is still parked and waiting, replies, "Okay, stand by for takeoff. I will call you." But inside the Pan Am cockpit, they hear the KLM pilot say he is taking off. Panicked, the Pan Am crew immediately keys their microphone and says, "We are still taxiing down the runway." This visual represents how 1970s aviation radios functioned. They worked like walkie-talkies, Only one person could transmit at a time. If two people pushed their microphones in the exact same second, the frequencies overlapped and canceled each other out. Because the tower and Pan Am transmitted simultaneously, the KLM cockpit never heard the warning. Instead, they heard exactly 3.75 seconds of static. The KLM plane speeds down the runway at over 150 miles per hour. Through the fog, the Pan Am crew sees the headlights rushing toward them. They slam their engines to full power, desperately trying to swerve the massive jet into the grass. Captain Van Zonten sees the Pan Am plane and pulls the nose up hard to try and fly over them. But remember that 50 tons of extra fuel he demanded? That weight anchored the jet. The tail dragged across the pavement, preventing the plane from climbing. The KLM landing gear and engines sheared straight through the Pan Am jet. Technology failed at the worst possible second. But the underlying reason those planes collided was a culture of unquestioned deference. A co-pilot knew something was wrong, but the social cost of challenging an absolute authority figure kept him quiet. The heat from the excess fuel caused massive fires that overwhelmed emergency crews. And in a final, heartbreaking twist of fate, just 4 minutes after the collision, the dense fog cleared from Los Rodeos Airport. International investigators descended on the Canary Islands to figure out what happened. They concluded that no single piece of machinery broke. The real failure was the cockpit culture itself, an environment where questioning a captain's judgment was practically a fireable offense. This tragedy forced a reconstruction of cockpit culture, leading to the birth of Crew Resource Management, or CRM. Today, co-pilots are explicitly trained and required to challenge captains if they suspect an error. This agreement in the cockpit is no longer insubordination, it is a mandatory safety mechanism. Technical rules change too. Phrases like "cleared for takeoff" became strictly protected language, banned from use in any casual radio chatter. And ground radar became a global standard, ensuring controllers would never again have to guess where a 300-ton aircraft was parked. So, the next time you're sitting on a runway, frustrated by a delay, listening to a pilot wait for a boring radio clearance, remember that you are participating in a system built on lessons learned the hard way. That meticulous double-checking is the direct, life-saving legacy of the 583 people lost in the fog of Tenerife.